focused on protecting the Constitution and the separation of church and state. We've been doing that since 2010. We have some incredible programming, including our Friday updates from all kinds of amazing speakers. We've got historians, authors, elected officials, journalists, professors, etc. Next Friday is Thanksgiving week, so we will all be taking a well-deserved break. But please join us Friday, December 1st, when we will be speaking to Professors Miles Armley and David Buckley to discuss their research, Christian nationalism and political violence, victimhood, racial identity, conspiracy, and support for the Capitol attacks. So you definitely don't want to miss that one. But for today, we are joined by Andrew Jorgenson. He is a professor of sociology and founding director of the Climate and Society Lab at the University of British Columbia. Working in the areas of environmental sociology, global political economy, and the sociology of development, he conducts research on the human dimensions of global and regional environmental change with a primary focus on the societal causes and consequences of the climate crisis. In 2020, Andrew received the I don't know if it's Buttel, we'll just say Fred Buttel Distinguished Contribution Award from the American Sociological Association section on environmental sociology. He is an appointed author of the 5th National Climate Assessment of the U.S. Global Change Research Program, an appointed member of the U.S. National Advisory Environmental Health Sciences Council for the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, and a research fellow in the Department of Theoretical Economics at Vilnius University. Whoa, that is one meaty resume. Fantastic, and welcome. Did I miss anything?
No, thank you. That's really embarrassing and humbling to hear folks introduce you like that. And no, and I realize that, yeah, some of those titles with the agency stuff, it's really long-winded. And so I was very impressed with how you're able to cover all of that so well. And it's some folks say Buttel and some folks say Buttel as far as Fred Buttel's name. So kind of tomato, I think.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no, I learned how to read. Yeah. And with this, I am just going to go ahead and hand it right over to you. I know you have a presentation to share with us, and let's just get right into it, Andrew.
Okay, let me go ahead and make sure that I am, we're still, even after all these years of Zoom, pandemic Zoom, I think we're still getting used to, so can you all see my slides? Can I get an affirmative?
Not yet.
Okay, I think I need to hit the share screen button again. Yep.
There you go.
You would think that I would know by now. Okay, right, I'm assuming you can now.
Yes, we can see it.
Good. Now you probably, okay.
One thing that I did forget to ask you, Andrew, would you like questions as they come up, or would you like to wait until the end?
Either way is fine. I'm eager to try to keep this at 30 minutes or so because I'm eager for conversation and discussion, but whatever folks prefer, okay. I'm happy with it. I'm going to try to keep this as kind of conversational as possible. And yeah, so either way is fine with me. Thanks for asking, though.
Sounds good. Yep.
Okay, so let's see here. Okay. Just trying to figure out where to move me. Okay, there we go. Okay, so first of all, I just wanted to thank you all for the opportunity to be here and be part of this series, which looks super duper interesting. And I've been asked to talk about some research that my colleagues and I have been doing, focusing on the impacts, the climate impacts of the world's militaries. So what I'm going to do is give you all an overview, kind of a global overview of two related projects. The first focuses on how the world's militaries, national militaries, shape how economic growth contributes to carbon emissions. And the second is a new study that hasn't been published yet, but that focuses directly on the energy consumption of the US military and how reducing military spending could really lead to substantial reductions in fossil fuel energy consumption that are non-trivial. I also wanted to mention too that coincidentally, I was in Arizona last week down in Tucson for work at the university, and then drove up to Prescott to visit family. My mother and stepfather live up in Prescott, and it's just such a lovely area. How the natural environment changes so much during that drive, and so this was really a lovely coincidence. And I'm at University of British Columbia, but I'm originally from the U.S. I just moved here from Boston College this last summer, and I was born and raised in the Western U.S. And so it's really lovely to be asked to be a part of this. And so this work that I'm going to talk about is part of a broader area of interdisciplinary social science research that it's the technical name is it's focusing on anthropogenic drivers of climate change. But more simply, what this work does is we use a range of research methods, mostly statistical modeling techniques, and we do a lot of hypothesis testing in this work to assess the societal causes of the climate crisis, where we try to understand how different structural characteristics, especially of nation states, but also at smaller units, such as at the US state level, how different characteristics of societies shape energy consumption and carbon emissions for nations or for US states, or even down at facility levels at the power plant level, for example. And so this work is very interdisciplinary. And if you're interested in what folks have done more broadly and what the research suggests, this is a piece that we co-authored, and it's publicly available, so it's not paywalled, and it's co-authored by folks in sociology, geography, anthropology, and archaeology. And we give a nice overview of what sort of the research suggests in general on anthropogenic drivers. And I also wanted to mention too that some of you might know that the 5th National Climate Assessment of the USGCRP was just released a few days ago. And this is in the US, the federal government sort of major climate assessment that comes out every 3 or 4 years. And in this 5th NCA, we're happy to say that there is an explicit discussion and synthesis of the anthropogenic drivers research literature that I took a part in co-authoring. And within that, we also do include a brief discussion of the peer-reviewed research on the role that the world's militaries have played thus far in contributing to the climate crisis. And this is all very publicly available. You've probably seen news stories about it, sort of in the news cycle right now to some extent. But I definitely encourage you to take a look at this climate assessment. There are a bunch of different chapters, including regionally specific chapters. And so you could find and locate the chapter that focuses on the Southwest US. It really zooms in and focuses on the climate kind of concerns and relevance of the impacts for Arizona and adjacent states. So getting back to the research that I'm going to talk about today, this study, Guns versus Climate, was published in the American Sociological Review, which is our discipline's, one of our discipline's 2 flagship journals a few months ago. And this was a collaborative project with colleagues at a bunch of different universities and some of my current and former PhD students. And we referred to this also as our pandemic project. We started working on this research about 2 or 3 weeks into the pandemic when the world went sideways. And, research can take a long time. And so as this did, and so it did just get published in 2023. And this research, a big motivation for this study was to help advance the drivers research that focuses on how economic growth contributes to the climate crisis, or really specifically the relationship between economic growth and carbon emissions, which is a major theme within the drivers literature that has enormous policy implications. And the research on this is very substantial. And the study here on the right that my colleague Brett Clark and I published back when I was faculty at University of Utah a number of years ago, and Brett is still at University of Utah, we published the study in the American Journal of Sociology, which is the other flagship journal for our discipline. And in that study, we longitudinally looked at the changing relationships between economic growth and carbon emissions for nations in different structural contexts. And this is just like an example of this area of work on economic growth and carbon emissions. And one of the motivations in this area of work, though, is to try to get a better understanding of how other societal characteristics and structural characteristics of societies and relationships between societies might shape or moderate or amplify or reduce the impacts of economic growth on carbon emissions. So in a very general way, our current work on military in the Guns versus Climate article was motivated by this important approach to try to get a greater understanding of how other characteristics of society shape the effect of economic growth on carbon emissions. And we decided that it would be really important to focus on the role of militarization, or nations' militaries, given, kind of the history of the permanent war economy and the military industrial complex, which is something that has been studied greatly by historians and political scientists and sociologists and for a long time. And the title "Guns versus Climate" is actually a play on the longstanding debates in Guns versus Butter about military spending and military Keynesianism, for example, that have been going on for decades. So let me just jump into this work, because also I wanted to highlight that there is a growing area of research in the social sciences that focuses on the environmental impacts of militarization. I do want to acknowledge that this is separate from the enormous body of really important work that's been done on the environmental impacts of warfare and large-scale conflict, which is enormous and so incredibly important. This related body of work focuses on U.S. militaries as large-scale social institutions. This is something that sociologists and other social scientists study. We study social institutions. And so thinking of the world's militaries as social institutions and considering what their environmental impacts may be, whether they're good or bad, and under different sorts of contexts. And so this is a rapidly growing, small but rapidly growing area of research that is kind of cuts across disciplines. A lot of work in sociology has been done on this, work in political science, work in sustainability science, and I just kind of give you a visual here of some of the different journals, kind of in chronological order, where this type of work has been studied, published, that greatly informs our study and provides us a lot of background for the work that we're doing. And some of this research highlights a couple of things that I think are really important. For one, in the modern era, there's a growing emphasis on risk transfer militarism. And as the world's militaries become more technologically sophisticated, more capital intensive, when we visualize what a lot of conflicts look like now, they're drones, right? And there's there's a distancing between what's really taking place in terms of in theaters of warfare and who's also facilitating things. And this can lead to reductions in the killing of soldiers and troops, and the reductions in the amount of infrastructure and hardware that's on one side might be destroyed or harmed. But this is a growing emphasis that's really tied to modern forms of militarization that are tied to technology and the never-ending sort of arms race. And there's a theoretical perspective called treadmill of destruction theory that has emerged in recent decades that really focuses on the environmental impacts of militarization and how they're not limited to war and weapons testing. And this work also has focused on some of the environmental justice implications of military activities, for example, where military bases might be located and there's a high concentration of unexploded ordnance, and there are clear spatial patterns where this is more likely to take place near Native American reservations, for example. Some peer-reviewed research has shown this. Also, if we just again think of just the never-ending kind of arms race and these interconnections between the military and the state and the private sector and the defense industry, there's just this evolving infrastructure, and just research and development activities are just never-ending. And whenever R&D is taking place, this involves the use of materials, including fossil fuels and other materials that have direct and indirect environmental impacts. And what's really interesting too is that, and I think some of you are probably aware of this, the world's militaries are concerned about the climate crisis, and many of the world's militaries are motivated to become less reliant on fossil fuels and become more carbon efficient. But this is really difficult and challenging if we think of a lot of the traditional transportation types of vehicles, machineries that are used by militaries. They burn a ton of fossil fuel. And so these estimates here are just, kind of considered conservative estimates, but F-15 and F-16s burn about 1,600 gallons of fuel per hour, and helicopters 5 gallons for each mile traveled. Well, you see this here. And then aircraft carriers burn close to 6,000 gallons of fuel per hour. So there are some challenges here in terms of reducing energy consumption, fossil fuel energy consumption, and enhancing energy efficiency. And there's also an emphasis on how some political scientists have noted that militaries are potential actors in climate governance and potential leaders in climate governance and technological innovations. because they do consider climate change to be a threat multiplier. But at the same time, though, research has shown that nations that have larger and more powerful militaries tend to be much slower to ratify international climate agreements and other environmental agreements. So getting at the sort of the geopolitical complexities of these issues, right? And so this just some background on this. So moving into the research questions in our recent study on militarization, how it shapes the effects of economic growth on carbon emissions in general, and I'm just quickly summarizing this, we have a very long discussion of why we think that militarization shapes the effects of economic growth on carbon emissions. But generally, we argue that the complex and evolving arrangements around the world's militaries and the private sector shape the relationships between nations' carbon emissions and economic growth. This is tied to just the military-industrial complex, which has been around a long time, and it's global. And so we argue that the impact of economic growth on carbon emissions is likely greater for nations with relatively larger and more capital-intensive militaries. So those nations that have larger militaries and that are more capital-intensive, this is going to be a situation in which we're going to likely see a larger effect of economic growth on carbon emissions. And so then to do this analysis, we argue that both military expenditures per soldier, which is our common way of measuring the capital intensiveness of militaries, and military participation rate, which is how we measure the relative size of militaries, both enlarge the effect of economic growth on carbon emissions. And so for those of you that are familiar with statistical analyses, we're looking at statistical interactions in our models. And further, we argue that each of these military characteristics increases the extent to which the other amplifies the effects of economic growth on carbon emissions. More broadly, what this means is for nations that have really high levels of both military participation rate and military expenditures per soldier, this is especially where we're likely to see a greater effect of economic growth on carbon emissions. And so in our study, we estimate a ton of models using different modeling techniques that are very common in the social sciences. We look at both per capita emissions as a dependent variable as well as total emissions. And I will just say right up front that our results are incredibly robust. And we generally find that this slide right here is presenting some coefficient plots here just from some of the baseline models. And what you really want to focus on here is at the very bottom, where there is this interaction between GDP per capita, military expenditures, and military participation rate. You see this little green dot and these little green lines, and this is the estimated coefficient for this three-way interaction and the confidence intervals. And you see that it's above 0, and this is telling us that there is a positive three-way statistical interaction that is statistically significant, and that in general confirms our hypothesis. And then we estimate a ton of models where we take into consideration all sorts of other factors of nations that matter in terms of, governance, democratization, different demographic characteristics, oil production, arms production and exports. And bottom line, our results are incredibly robust. But it's hard to wrap your mind around, well, what does this really mean besides we just see something that's statistically significant? So thinking of the substantive relevance of these findings, this figure here provides graphically what happens at the 10th percentile, the 50th percentile, and the 90th percentile of our two military measures from left to right. And then you see these sort of orange dots and bars, and this is showing you what the estimated effect of GDP per capita on per capita carbon emissions is as these two military measures are higher for nations where they're higher. And you see a clear pattern from left to right. And what this basically tells us that once nations have at least middle levels of relative levels of these two military measures, we start to see an increase in the estimated effect of GDP per capita on per capita carbon emissions. And over here to the right, we see that especially for nations where these two military characteristics are very high, we see a greatly enlarged effect of GDP per capita on per capita carbon emissions. So this gives you a little bit of a sense, but I realize that this is still quite abstract. So let's get more specific here. let me first give you an idea of what kinds of nations might we be talking about that have relatively low, medium, or high levels of military participation rate or military expenditures per soldier. So you might be wondering, where does the US fall? Where the United States has a very high military expenditures per soldier and incredibly high. Our participation rate is relatively medium compared to other nations, the way in which this is typically operationalized. We see that kind of in the mid levels of both participation rate and expenditures per soldier, we see nations like China, Colombia, and Russia. In the bottom right-hand corner, Israel would be a clear example of a nation that has a very high expenditures per soldier and a very high military participation rate. Where I currently live in Canada, you would see that we have a mid-level of expenditures per soldier and a relatively low military participation rate, just to give you a sense of where some of these nations fall. But to get a more concrete understanding of how much this really matters in terms of actual carbon emissions and what could happen in a world where nations had much lower military expenditures and lower military participation rates. Here, this presents some projections from a counterfactual history exercise based upon our statistical analyses, where what we do here is this line in the middle is just the average per capita carbon emissions at each time point for all the nations in our study. Okay, and we compare this global average that has occurred. These are the real world data to what would happen in a world where all nations had incredibly high military expenditures and participation rate versus in a world that has where all nations had very low military expenditures and military participation rate. And so the line on the bottom, the dotted line on the bottom, is illustrating what per capita carbon emissions would be predicted to be in a world of low militarization in terms of when we think about how it indirectly shapes the effects of economic growth on carbon emissions. So these are per capita carbon emissions, and this is measured in metric tons per capita, but I think that the figure speaks for itself. You see that there would be or could be an enormous reduction globally in per capita carbon emissions in a world where militaries are simply smaller and there's less expenditures directed towards them.
Real quick, there's a question here from Mark, a clarification. Not quite sure I understand the military participation rate. Is that percentage of GDP that goes to the military?
Thank you. That's a really good question. I kind of rushed over this. And so this is focusing on the relative size of the labor force in militaries. So this is the percent of the of a population, the adult population that is employed in the military. And so so it's a size of, and this is a common way that social scientists measure the relative size of militaries. Okay, so let me quickly move on to the second part, which I think some of you might find more interesting and telling, because this really focuses on the U.S. military. And this work is current, and it's a study that's currently under review at a science journal, so it hasn't been published yet. In this work, we're very motivated by the kind of work that I just summarized, and also one of the key limitations of it, because in the study that I just summarized, while it's suggestive of how militarization can shape how economic growth contributes to carbon emissions, in that kind of research, we're not using direct measures of military consumption or military emissions. We're looking at overall national measures of carbon emissions. And so in this present study, what we're doing is we're looking at the Department of Defense's own data on energy consumption for the U.S. military, and we're looking at military spending in the U.S. to see, and this is considered a time series analysis, where we're looking at how military spending, U.S. military spending, is associated directly with energy consumption of the U.S. military and how this changes through time. And one of the, well, we believe it's incredibly important to focus on the U.S. military, as others do. There's been recent scholarly commentaries in such venues as Science that have highlighted concerns about the U.S. military being unsustainable, and there's been some really important historical work done that has charted through time the Pentagon and its contributions to climate change and war. And a book just came out by Nita Crawford, who I believe is a political scientist by training or a geographer, one of the two, but kind of focuses a really interesting historical account of the U.S. military and climate change. And the U.S. military is the largest military in the world in terms of its annual expenditures and its overall reach, just based upon publicly available data, and this is sort of widely known. And so we think that it's, for a variety of reasons, it's really important to sort of drill in and focus on just the U.S. Military and its potential impacts on the climate crisis. So this is work that I'm doing with Ryan Toombs, who just defended their dissertation in sociology a few weeks ago. So now Dr. Toombs and my colleague Brett Clark, who is a professor of sociology and sustainability studies just north of you all at the University of Utah. So we conducted time series analysis of the relationship between direct energy consumption for the Department of Defense and U.S. military expenditures from the 1975 to 2022 period. And we're able to separate an energy consumption into a couple of general categories. We're able to look at facilities like bases and installations and lily pads, for example, versus vehicles and equipment. And then we also get a little bit more nuanced and look at jet fuel compared to other fuels, all other energy sources. And then we just look at fossil fuel consumption versus renewables. We do want to note, though, that renewable energy consumption, direct energy consumption for the Department of Defense is really small. And in 2022, it was less than 1% of direct energy consumption total for the Department of Defense. And in the analyses, we're interested in what happens when military expenditures increase. What does that do to energy consumption versus when military expenditures decrease? What does that do to energy consumption? And so that's what we mean here by directional asymmetry. And so this figure here is just graphing out what these values look like annually. And I want to mention, this is all publicly available data for this study as well as for the prior study that I summarized that's been published. So the blue line represents just total energy consumption from the Department of Defense from over this time period. And you see the line is going down. So overall direct energy consumption for the U.S. military has declined. When we separate this into vehicles and equipment versus facilities, I think the patterns speak for themselves. The overall reduction in direct energy consumption largely mirrors the trend for reductions in energy consumption for vehicles and equipment, which is the green line. And then for facilities, we see that it's gone down as well, but it's in a little bit more of a linear fashion. But overall, direct energy consumption for the U.S. military has gone down. And then for military expenditures, which is the dotted red line, we see that in general through time, it's increased, and it's sort of cycled up and down for a range of reasons, but there's an overall net increase through time. But this figure right here doesn't, clearly suggest what the direct relationship might be between military spending and energy consumption. And so this is why we need to use some pretty sophisticated modeling techniques, time series techniques, to get a sense of things. And so what we do find in general is we do find asymmetry for overall direct energy consumption, but largely due to vehicles and equipment. And what we mean here by asymmetry is we see that in general, when military spending increases, this does lead to a general increase in energy consumption. But when military spending decreases, we see a much larger decrease in energy consumption. And this is what we mean by asymmetry, which suggests then that perhaps reducing military spending, even by a small proportion, could have a very non-trivial impacts in terms of reducing overall energy consumption for the U.S. military, which again is overwhelmingly fossil fuel energy consumption. And to wrap your mind around what this really could look like, this figure here, based upon the analyses that we've done, we do future projections based upon the analyses to see what would happen if in the future if U.S. Military expenditures decreased by a bunch versus sort of a mid-level versus a little versus just kind of stayed steady in terms of the historical average compared to the last, roughly 50 years. And so the right half of this figure here is plotting out a projected amounts of energy consumption tied to different scenarios for military spending. And what we see here, this line in orange on the bottom shows what could happen to overall energy consumption for the US military if just on annually, there is a decrease in military spending by about 6.5%. So we're not talking about enormous reductions, but a decrease by 6.5%. This would lead to a very substantial decrease in energy consumption. And to further wrap your mind around what this really means in compared to other places in the world, if we compare that decrease that could happen if we reduced US military spending by about 6.5% per year annually, this would be the equivalent of annual reductions in energy consumption on par with what the nation of Slovenia in total consumes annually. Not Slovenia's military, but the nation itself. That's how much energy consumption, fossil fuel energy consumption, could be reduced if the US military spending went down annually by about 6.5%. And Slovenia, compared to other nations, if we arrange from the highest to lowest in terms of energy consumption for nation states, Slovenia is not a trivial case. It's I believe it's either the 94th or the 95th rank ordered from high to low. And there's over 200 nation states in the world. So we're talking about a rather substantial amount of energy consumption reduction that could take place with just modest decreases in military spending, US military spending. So a couple of key takeaways. I realize I've covered a lot of ground and some of this got a bit technical, but one of the things that I'd like to emphasize is that even though I spoke to you today about how militaries can contribute to the climate crisis, this is a very understudied area still, and we believe that much more work should be done. We think it has enormous implications for climate mitigation and a range of other topics. Especially, militaries do consider climate change a threat multiplier, as I mentioned before. And this is something that the Pentagon is quite open about, and you can read their own materials where they emphasize this point for geopolitical reasons and concerns about stability domestically and internationally. But there still is this kind of geopolitical kind of complex and challenge, because at the same time, nations that have larger and more powerful militaries are slower to sign and environmental and climate agreements. So there are these kind of contradictions at play that really highlight just the complexities of geopolitics in the arms race. So our research does show quite consistently that national level militarization amplifies effective economic growth on carbon emissions for nations throughout the world, sort of the first half of my talk. And the next half in our preliminary work shows specifically that the takeaway point is that reducing US military spending just modestly could lead to very substantial decreases in fossil fuel energy consumption that are really quite substantial. And of course, more broadly, from a sort of a broader sustainability perspective, we believe that, as many others do, that there could be multiple benefits or dividends to reducing military spending, even by trivial amounts. The money could be directed to other programs, right, that could help with decarbonization efforts and the much needed energy transition that needs to take place all over the world. It could be provided and put into other kinds of social programs to enhance human well-being and deal with the enormous population health disparities, for example, that are still occurring across the United States. So besides the climate benefits of reducing military spending, we believe that there are also a range of other direct and indirect societal benefits that could come into play. So I believe that I'm right at 30 minutes, so I'm going to go ahead and stop there. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
And there are a few. I'm going to go back and get to the first one. This one's coming from Peter. And this was early on in your presentation. And he asks, have you gotten any response or possibly cooperation from the Department of Defense? Great question.
It's a wonderful question, and it's really interesting. The second study that I talked about, I presented this preliminary work down at University of Arizona last week, and it was to a very interdisciplinary audience, Society for Human Ecology, and that was the first question that I got asked by folks. And it's like, so have you had a chance to talk to folks really in the U.S. military about this work and what they're thinking? And we haven't with this particular study directly yet, because it's still preliminary. We'd very much like to, and we're very, we'd welcome the opportunity to, because we believe that there's a lot that we could learn. We're outsiders, we're academics doing this work as outsiders, right? And so we believe in the co-production of knowledge, and that being able to work with and learn from folks in the military, including academic scientists that work for the military, would be greatly beneficial. I will say that anecdotally, as a professor that's worked at universities across the US now and Canada, that when I've talked about this this topic in different courses through the years, I've had a lot of amazing conversations with students that are either currently active, in the military, or have served prior, and they feel that from their experiences that this is very familiar. This makes a lot of sense. And some of the stories that I've heard about their experiences in terms of what they observed being in the military, and so we've had those kinds of conversations. But the published study that came out in ASR earlier this year, we've gotten inquiries from different civil society groups, for example, but nothing from anyone in the military. But we would welcome the opportunity.
Yeah, good question. Okay, let's see. This is a good question too. John asks, how do U.S. military carbon emissions compare percentage-wise with carbon emissions due to transportation, home heating and cooling, et cetera?
Right, and this is a really important point. And so while we showed in the second study that the reduction in fossil fuel energy consumption that could occur if there was just a modest decrease, right, is on par with what Slovenia as a nation consumes. If we step back and think about overall kind of net fossil fuel consumption for the US as a whole, it's a relatively small percentage of the national level fossil fuel consumption. But let's keep in mind that in a contemporary context and globally and historically, we're the US, and I say we because I'm from the US, there is this historic disproportional contribution that the US has made as a nation state to the climate crisis. So that's a really good question. We need to keep in mind that overall, it's a small slice, but it's still substantial. But given that it's such a small slice, that highlights how enormous the impacts of the US has on the climate crisis. Now, it is true to note, though, that overall energy consumption and carbon emissions for the US as a whole have declined in recent years. This is something that's highlighted in the National Climate Assessment that just came out last week. And the explanations for that are multiple, right? There's a lot of reasons why they're going down, which is great. That's what we want to see.
And another question here in the chat, and it says, have there been, this is another great question. Mark says, have there been any studies on the economic costs of diplomacy versus defense, i.e. spending by the U.S. Department of State versus Department of Defense? Good question.
It's a really good question. And I'm going to be perfectly honest and say offhand, I don't know. I'm guessing there probably is. And, it's, I believe in being perfectly honest and saying I don't know when I don't know, and not trying to come up with some half-baked answer. So I really don't know, but that's a really good question. And
yeah,
writing it down.
Now you have to find the people who are doing those studies and get together and have a party. Yeah,
this is one of the and I have a feeling this is probably something that's come up in a lot of the other discussions you've had with other guests in these series, that just so many of these things that we're studying are ultimately require just the expertise and the knowledge of different disciplines and different groups and different stakeholder groups. And so, I'm formally trained in sociology. And so, I know what I know, and I approach these questions from the lens of being trained in global sociology. But clearly, if I think of my university campus, there are folks across campus in different disciplines that are asking similar kinds of questions from different perspectives that have different backgrounds and knowledge bases, such as, what was just asked. So that's a great question, but I don't know.
Really good question. Yeah, we have smart people that come to these things.
Yeah. And by the way, someone just commented, they asked if that's a Fugazi repeater album cover in the back, and yes, it is.
I noticed it too. Okay, now here's one. John says, to play devil's advocate, Francis Fukuyama was wrong to proclaim the end of history, and we are now threatened by totalitarian regimes on all sides, from Hamas, Putin, Iran, and China. Excuse me. Reducing military expenditure could expose us to even more serious existential threats than climate change. Your response?
I respectfully disagree, because if you look at just the enormity of the U.S. military and our military budget, it's so much greater than other nations that just modest decreases in military spending that also, and anyone that has been involved in balancing budgets, right? Like for the U.S. military, if we made a modest reduction in the military budget, wouldn't that force the U.S. military to be smarter and more efficient with how they're allocating the resources and reduced waste in military spending? So it could also perhaps push the U.S. military to be more efficient in how they use their resources, that could then have longer term benefits and further propelling the U.S. military to be more motivated to become less reliant on fossil fuels and be much more heavily invested in moving towards renewables. It's in the U.S. military's interest to become less reliant on fossil fuels, especially during, and this is something that a lot of research has suggested, that you can read in white papers and gray papers that the U.S. military has publicly available, that kind of out in theaters of warfare, right? That being reliant on fossil fuels makes them more vulnerable when they're having these supply chains of bringing fossil fuels to tanks out in theaters of warfare, right? If these machines, were less reliant on fossil fuels and were more efficient, that could be motivated by a reduction in military spending that could force the military to put greater emphasis on. I think you get what I'm saying. I'm being pretty long-winded, but I do want to acknowledge, though, that I think that question that was asked, it's an important question. Like, these are this is where it's sort of highlighting that there are major threats and sustainability challenges that we face, and thinking of instability in the world and different kinds of instabilities is huge. But the climate crisis could exacerbate this as we experience the impacts of climate change unevenly throughout the world. This can lead to greater instability, right? That could lead to anyway.
No, those are all really good points.
Great question, though, an issue to be raised.
This one's more of a comment. Mars says, so chemtrails aren't a thing, but we are dumping halotoxins into the atmosphere through our fossil fuel use. Absolutely. Chemtrail, we have a politician here, Chemtrail Kelly. I don't remember if it was Kelly Ward or Kelly Townsend. They're really, a lot of folks in Arizona who are elected officials are also conspiracy theorist QAnon type. So that's a super fun thing that we have going on here. Let's see. Ken says we could slash our military budget in half, but no one will agree on which half. Boy, ain't that the truth. Yep. Yeah. Matt says, such gross inefficiency in the Army, and I doubt it has improved since my day. And he says, on your last comment, I absolutely agree, Andrew. Let's see. Jude says, good topics to ask political candidates about, not the usual, and may provoke change someday. Yeah, I mean, I think it's, we have, a committee in the legislature that focuses on environmental concerns and things like that. But this organization, we don't necessarily focus on that a lot, and like, unless it's motivated by some kind of, religious exemption, but that's not really where we are. So maybe it's time to start paying attention, better attention to those meetings and find out what they're talking about. Let's see, US budget. Peter says US budget for the State Department is 60.4 billion. The Department of Defense, 773 billion for fiscal year 2023. So that definitely shows us where our priorities are. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Here we go. Lindsay says until the GOP tries to remove accurate climate change facts from school curricula, which we've actually seen that happen because we monitor school board candidates and school board members. We had a board member earlier this year who voted against a science curriculum because it acknowledged, the existence of trans people, and then also because it didn't teach creationism. So that's where we are too. Matt says diplomacy through superior firepower, and we wonder why so many hate the US. Indeed. And then there is one question here in the Q&A. Does your study include the CO2 amounts for the production of military hardware and weapons in the private sector?
Yes.
For example, Boeing, General Dynamics, etc.
Yes. In the initial study, absolutely. And we believe that that's a big part of what explains our findings, just the enormity of the defense industry. I should mention, like, my mother worked for Lockheed. I grew up in Northern California. And so, like, we think that a big part of what explains those findings is just the complex relationships between the private sector and the state and the military, and just the defense industry, as well as adjacent industries that are tied to it. So yeah, this has really far-reaching implications across different sectors of the economy. Excellent point. Yeah.
Let's see. Mark says, as a former U.S. Department of State affiliate, I agree. Peace is less expensive than war. There's an organization called Veterans for Peace too, and they have this little tagline that says something like, any veteran of wartime situation is a pacifist. I don't remember who the quote was attributed to, but it was some famous general or something like that. Let's see. Ken says militarization as a cultural phenomenon also has significant indirect knock-on effects. Civilian infrastructure and economy that depends on military consumer products that mimic military culture. Think guns and Humvees. These are big contributors to climate change as well. Great point.
And we think that also is a great illustration. That's a part in our published study. We dive in and talk about that as one of the pathways in which militarization is shaping how overall economic growth does contribute to the climate crisis. A lot of things that are initially developed for use by militaries are then become consumer products like Humvees. Let's remember a few decades ago when that was the thing, right? We can also thank the military for the internet. Let's not forget that its impacts in role in advancing information technology. And we may not be on such a great Zoom call right now if it wasn't for the role of the U.S. military in R&D on information technology. So just as a way of highlighting some of the positive ways in which technological innovations tied to militaries can have beneficial impacts on society. I also wanted to mention too and acknowledge that there has been a lot of research in the past across many disciplines that has highlighted the benefits that individuals and families can experience, sort of the upward mobility benefits of serving in the military. That was sort of a long-standing finding, a lot of earlier bodies of research. I would like to note that more recent studies have shown that those benefits have largely gone away, that the wider benefits that were observed in earlier decades for individuals that would serve in the military in terms of upward mobility, that it's become much more unequal, that just a smaller proportion of folks that serve experience upward mobility benefits, whereas for everyone else, it's just sort of flattened. And Matt, I see your comment, and so that sort of longstanding benefit, and this is sort of tied to these earlier debates also about guns versus butter that were very prominent in security studies in earlier decades.
All right, let's see. Okay, Patricia, supply chain and communities they expose to high emissions. She's just agreeing, I think.
Yeah.
There's a little note there for Ken. Think of the costs, the social costs of creating veterans versus not sending people to war. Imagine that, mind blown.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay, I'm going to say it. Why don't we direct a little bit more money towards taking care of our veterans?
right?
You know,
Yeah.
I'll just it's so awful to see how poorly funded VAs are in the U.S. You know,
Mhm.
it's and I'm saying that as someone who just visited their stepfather in Prescott, who is a veteran and has wonderful people that care for him at the VA in Prescott, but it's clear that it's a very, very underfunded facility, which is part of a very underfunded institution. Like, wrap your mind like that's just, yeah. I'm
Yeah.
not saying
Well,
that as a social scientist. I'm saying that as a son. Like, it's something, as someone growing up in the US, it's awful.
well, and then you take into consideration too, you mentioned Prescott, which is a more rural area. And, there are some of these veterans who have to travel, I mean, hundreds of miles to be able to get the care that they need, like not everybody lives in an urban setting. I have a friend whose
Yeah.
parents are, they spend their summers up in Heber. And in order for them to be able to, not just as older folks to be able to get the care that they need is difficult. But then for him, because he's a retired Air Force mechanic,
Oh,
he usually just has to come down to the valley if he needs,
wow. That's
yeah,
some, yeah.
yeah.
Sorry to get a little
Um,
off topic, but I think it's quite related.
well, and this is part of the discussions that we have, to juxtapose, we have evangelical extremists who call themselves Christians, but then demand that we cut spending for veterans, right? Or even refuse to give the medical or to fulfill the medical needs of the folks who jumped in on 9/11, like that kind of stuff. Where's your morality? If you've got this book that dictates your morality, where's your morality? So it's kind of
Yeah.
the same thing. These are discussions that humanist types like all of us have.
Right.
How should we treat our fellow humans? Not like what does the scripture tell me I should do? Because it usually
Yeah.
doesn't seem to match. you know. Mars says swords to plowshares, turn the other cheek, do unto others. Yes, thank you. Matt says it's horrible. I refuse benefits because I will not deal with the VA. I'm fortunate enough to not need to, but so many buddies don't have
Yeah.
that luxury. And and who knows when Matt might need to tap into the VA, and then he's got to go through the whole process, and it's a big pain in the butt. And then you see unhoused people. There's a few in my
Right.
neighborhood, that are veterans, and the fact that they're unhoused is
The amount of veterans that are homeless and housing
Mhm.
insecure veterans in the US, it's another awful situation.
Well, and then of course too, when we are talking about climate change,
Yeah.
I've talked to evangelical extremists who are like, I don't care, like because this is all part of God's plan, and we're all just here so we can go to heaven anyway. And I'm like, but
Yeah.
you know what? That's not my jam. So I would actually like for the environment to be sustained
Yeah.
for my children and my grandchildren. Yeah, it's very strange.
Well, I would mention though that it's on, on the flip side, I have many extended relatives that are much more politically and religiously conservative, but we were able to find common ground on environmental concerns, given a lot of them work in agriculture, for example, and they're just so heavily reliant on water. They're growing alfalfa in central Utah, and so they're so concerned about water. And so that's sort of a commonality where we can identify spaces of commonality, right? That I think are, well, yeah, it's
No,
so important to try to
it's
find.
and it's so interesting too, because our former chair for Secular AZ is himself like a fifth generation farmer and rancher out in the way West Valley. And he's also very active with like the Farm Bureau and some of these other agricultural groups who tend to be a lot more politically conservative. And while yes, they might, but then he talks too about like, well, if they're some of the farmers that have the most money in Arizona, they don't care,
Yeah,
because
it's true.
that really is essentially how you get access to water. If you are able to buy that super expensive equipment that will allow for like a drip irrigation system, then great. Or if if you've got enough money to just keep drilling and get all the water, then you can do that too. All right, Janice says the longest straw wins. Indeed. Janice says, I've always thought if Adam and Eve were tasked to take care of the garden, would Christians would think it more important to take care of this world we are given by God. Yeah. So doing this work has to be kind of, like, I mean, is it depressing to do this work when you start seeing these numbers and you start thinking of the existential climate crisis we're all
Yeah.
facing? And how do you have hope?
That's a great question. Because it's and I get asked this a lot too. And now that I've been this has been my job for now 20 years. I can say that I have more hope and optimism now than I did before, growing optimism and hope than I did before, which may seem a bit counterintuitive because all data suggests that things are still trending and not in a good way. There's a couple of reasons why. The students, the younger generations that I have the privilege of engaging with in this kind of institutional context at universities and colleges, in across the continent and spending time around the world. Earlier generations are incredibly concerned and motivated and very solutions oriented. It's like, okay, we have this crisis. What are we going to do about it? They're inheriting this, and so in our classes, they want us to talk more about solutions rather than, okay, we get it. We know, let's talk, what can we do about this? So there's that. But also like the projections that I shared with you, like these non-trivial like spending cuts and military spending, how it could lead to pretty notable decreases in energy consumption, something that simple. That's a little example of there's a potential pathway, right? In other areas of research that are growing in the social sciences, because there's a great emphasis on we need this global, energy transition. We need to decarbonize the entire world economy and global infrastructure, right? And that's a systemic challenge that is going to be enormous. There's also growing research, systematic research, that shows that at the same time, if we can identify different kinds of egregious polluters or super polluters, you see this book behind me that has that title on it, but whether it's more egregious polluting facilities or power plants or whatever, that if we're able to identify egregious polluters and deal with them more directly and immediately, that they're kind of low-hanging fruit, that if we can get egregious polluters to change their pollution behaviors immediately or more quickly while we're dealing with these systemic challenges that are much harder, that can greatly help in terms of climate mitigation. The other thing that I would say too is if you look at public opinion, I don't do public opinion research. That's the thing. That's the most common thing that natural scientists, they assume, oh, you're a social scientist, you do work on climate, you must study attitudes about the environment. It's like, I don't, but a lot of social science does. That's true. If you do look at public opinion research, for example, in the US, you do see that things are trending in a good direction, and that larger percentages of the US population are acknowledging that climate change is human caused, right?
Yeah.
And also concern about the climate crisis is growing. And this is also for folks in different categories, regardless of, like the within those that self-identify as conservative or Republican, they still, it's trending in the right direction to the
Yep.
extent to which public opinion can make a difference. So I think that that's very encouraging in the US context. And also being in Canada now, seeing there's a lot of similar challenges here in Canada that I'm learning about in terms of trying to deal with energy and climate. So it's interesting to recognize that while the US is an outlier in many ways, in a not so great way when it comes to the climate crisis, there's also a lot of underlying similarities in the kinds of institutional challenges that are being faced around the world. And I think that that's kind of I don't know why, but I see some optimism. For me, that's an optimistic thing. Like there's some underlying similarities in what the challenges are. throughout the world. I do
Mhm.
also want to mention to you a really important point, like a takeaway point that I should have had on my final slide. And this is just something, because I get asked this all the time. So Andrew, the climate crisis is pretty much about population growth. Like, we need to slow down population growth. That will solve the climate crisis. That's inconsistent with the science. Now, it is true that, just generally speaking, more people, generally more consumption, greater emissions. But on a per person basis, we see that what really matters much more so than just population size or growth is really affluence and economic growth, and also
Mhm.
inequality. There's a very small percentage of the global population that's sort of the affluent, the wealthy, globally speaking, are disproportionately responsible for the climate crisis and other environmental challenges. And, so it's not that population doesn't matter, but frankly, it's not the key driver that folks suggest that it is.
And we get told all the time to reduce our carbon footprint, and I do, I really
Right.
do. But us as individuals isn't going to make the same kind of impact as industry and the elite wealthy who fly around in
Right.
private jets and things like that. I just wrote a Substack today about late stage capitalism and how it's affecting everything that we do. So basically, this generation is more woke, which I'm super excited about. And I the only hope that I see with a lot of the problems that we face these days is in Gen Z, because they are incredible, and every day I learn about a new young person who's like,
Yeah.
okay, I am sick and tired of how people are handling this, and this is my problem to inherit, so I'm going to go ahead and just start carving out my own path to try to find a
Yeah.
solution to this. So Gen Z is where it's at.
And
Well,
let's keep
this
in mind that this is a generation that the impacts of the pandemic on this generation, a lot of them, this is where they experience the formative years of high school and college. For those that have had obviously there's a lot of inequality in higher education, but just where this is what they've been a big part of their lives. And so I think it even makes them even more impressive that their formative years they've been hunkered up at home, going to high school or college or graduating high school virtually, right?
Mhm.
But they're so committed to and so concerned about, trying to solve these problems for the common good. I see a growing emphasis in a shift from individualism to more of an emphasis on solutions for the common good. And that's how we need to approach these issues. This is about structural change, but solutions for the common good.
100%. And I think also with this, this is a generation that's always had information at their fingertips for their entire lives. This is a generation who has had to go through lockdown drills at schools, and may have even suffered themselves through an actual school shooting. And they're watching in real time, whereas they are getting engaged with their democracy, they are watching the adults
Yeah.
just completely ignore them. And that's going to keep happening. And we're going to start seeing even more of this generation stepping up and getting into elected positions, because they're sick and tired of how Gen X and the boomers and everybody else has handled these problems. So
Let's hope so.
I'll
Yeah.
I'll tell you what, there were a lot of compliments in the chat. People really
Thank you.
appreciate this conversation. I was scared because I was feeling like there's no way I'm smart enough to understand everything that he's saying right now, but you broke it all down and made it easier for folks like me to understand. So I appreciate you. I appreciate everybody who's here, and I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend and a great Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
All
Thanks,
right.
everyone. This was a great conversation. Take care, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.